Alright, so today we're talking about hump and slump molds. These are called drape molds. There's lots of different ways to do this. The first thing I want to do is show you where you can find the molds. So let's come away from the table, and over here on the bottom shelf, these are all of our drape molds. Some of them are plaster and they're in two pieces. Alright, so that would be one part and then this is the other. Then others are just plastic dishes that we've collected up over the years. That was a big like popcorn bowl. We've got some plastic plates to make plates and platters. So there's lots of different shapes in here. Look around. But when you are ready, if you want to do a drape mold, they're all down here on the very bottom shelf.
The first thing you'll need when you start a drape mold is a slab. So roll out a slab. This is called a slump mold, meaning that the slab sits down into the bowl. This is a hump mold, like a camel's hump. It goes along the top. You can use a plaster mold or any of the rounded objects we have around the room. So let's start with the slump mold. First, make your slab, lift it up carefully so you don't stretch it too much, and then place it over the mold. Push the edges of the clay in toward the center of the mold until the clay drapes down in the center, and then cut away the extreme excess. This is just going to be a rough cut. It's not going to be your final cut, but leaving the excess will cause the clay to stretch unnaturally in a way that we don't want. So once you've got the excess clay cut away, you can push in and use a sponge to push the clay down into the mold. Make sure you move the sponge around frequently as you do this and push firmly, but don't push through the clay. And make sure you sponge the top as well. Then you can use a fettling knife or a needle tool to cut along the edge of the plaster. Make sure you cut straight up and down. If you cut at an angle, you get an angled cut, which you don't want. So make sure you keep the knife or the needle tool, whatever you're using, straight up and down as you cut. Take a sponge and round out the edges so they look nice and neat and clean. And there you go. You want the clay to stiffen up. If you let it sit in the mold, it should stiffen fairly quickly. The plaster will suck water out of the clay, so you don't want to leave it for more than 24 hours. If you leave it for too long, the piece will dry out too much and you won't be able to do anything else to it. So no more than 24 hours when it's sitting in the plaster molds. Another option is what's called a hump mold, like a camel's hump. And it works with basically the same idea, except now you're draping the slab over the top of the mold, pushing down gently, and use a sponge to push the clay down to fit the shape of the mold. Use the sponge working from the center toward the outside edges of the clay. Then take a knife or a needle tool and cut away the excess. Again, remember, cutting at an angle will give you an angled cut, so make sure you cut straight. And then you would let the clay sit until it has stiffened up enough that it can hold its own shape. Don't let it sit too long. If it sits too long, it will shrink while it's drying, and the clay will crack as it tries to fit onto the mold. So make sure that you don't let it sit for too long, just until it's stiff enough to hold its own shape when it's not sitting on the mold. And remember, the plaster will pull the water out of your clay, so you have to watch these things carefully. If you'd like to use a metal or plastic bowl in order to create your piece, you can do that as well. You need to have a barrier between the plastic or the metal and the clay. Otherwise, you will not be able to get it off. It's very similar to our cardboard tubes we used for making cylinders. So you want to put newspaper between the clay and what you're using as a mold. But if you use a flat sheet of newspaper, you're going to get all kinds of wrinkles and yucky looking things. So tear the newspaper into strips. And then wet the strips. You can do this with a spray bottle, you can run them under the sink, or you can just dunk them in some water. But they should be wet. They'll form to the shape of the mold better and give you a better result if you have wet newspaper strips. Cover the entire mold with the newspaper, okay? Make sure no part of the mold is touching the clay without newspaper in between. It's okay if there's some excess hanging off the edge of the mold. We're going to get rid of it later anyway. So take a slab, in this case I'm just going to use the slab for my first demonstration, and press it onto the mold. Use a sponge to round it out. Cut off any excess. And then allow the slab to dry until stiff enough to hold its shape when it's off of the mold. But again, don't let it sit too long. If it dries too much, it will crack as it tries to shrink on that mold. So you have to make sure you remove it at the right time. These can sit on the plastic molds for more than 2 days as long as they're in a bag. On rounded bottom objects, make sure you add some feet, otherwise the object will wobble. Thanks for watching. Check out the examples. Don't forget, you can always combine this technique with other techniques you've learned in the past. You can add clay onto the piece, use interesting glazing techniques, impress with different stamps and textures, such as lace, incising, add handles to your piece, and don't forget to experiment with color too.